How you doing? We're going to be talking about Project Eternity. It's a thrill ride. I hope you're ready. So specifically what we're talking about are the wacky and zany and madcap challenges that come about making a Kickstarter-backed late 90s style fantasy PC computer role-playing game in this year, which I think is still 2013. By the way, I just wanted to say a thank you right away to our backers. This was a Kickstarter-funded project, and it was really great, and hopefully they're going to like what they see. So if you are not aware of what Project Eternity is, get out or wait 30 seconds, and I'll tell you all about it. It is an isometric, 2D and 3D, party-based fantasy role-playing game for Windows, OS X, and Linux, and it is using Unity. It is inspired by the Infinity Engine series of games. These were PC role-playing games based on the advanced Dungeons & Dragons and 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons rule sets from TSR and Wizards of the Coast. They were made by BioWare and Black Isle Studios in the late 90s and early 2000s using BioWare's Infinity Engine. Project Eternity is being developed by Obsidian Entertainment. It's actually a team of about 20 people right now. We are located in Irvine, California. We specialize in role-playing games, not just PC role-playing games, but console and PC role-playing games. And a lot of the people who are at the studio were former members of Black Isle Studios, including myself and all of the owners. Was Kickstarter funded? We had a Kickstarter campaign last year. We raised $3.9 million from about 74,000 backers, which was awesome. As you can see, we were quite excited by it. And it is currently in production right now. We passed out of pre-production a few months ago. Who am I? I'm Josh Sawyer. I'm the project director, and I'm a lead designer at Obsidian. I started my career in the game industry at Black Isle Studios in 1999. I've been at Obsidian since 2005. And most relevantly, I've worked on several Dungeons & Dragons games. The first one was Icewind Dale. I worked on the expansions to Icewind Dale, Icewind Dale 2, and also I was co-lead designer on Neverwinter Nights 2. So let's talk about Project Eternity's 3 things. These are things that we identified were the most important things about the game, things that we thought were extremely important to get right. And they've evolved a little bit over time, but they're still essentially the same. First, beautiful environments to explore. One of the reasons a 2D-based game is because people love the environments in the Infinity Engine. Even though it was made with rendering technology that looks a little old at this point in time, people love the look of the 2D backgrounds that were hand-touched up and all that cool stuff. Also, there were a lot of those environments. During our Kickstarter campaign, the backers backed 2 large cities. They backed a 15-level mega dungeon. I know they expect lots and lots of environments, so that has become an important thing for us to focus on as well. Party-based tactical combat was a big deal in most of the Infinity Engine games, some more so than others. The Icewind Dale games emphasized it a lot. Planescape Torment did not emphasize it quite so much, but it was a big part of the games nevertheless. We realized it's very important for us to get this right, and beyond just getting party-based tactical combat, it is important to get a traditional system feel. Systems that feel traditional in how they are constructed and how they work and how the player interacts with them. They do not need to be entirely traditional, but they need to feel traditional. And last, this is something that is pretty common with Obsidian games, a reactive story with great characters and mature themes. South Park will not have the last part of that, which is mature themes. However, the rest of Obsidian's games focus pretty heavily on that sort of stuff. The Infinity Engine games excelled in story, and it's something that we wanted to continue, although in a different way than we had been used to doing recently with console games. So let's talk about this thing that would seem to be probably easy, but it's not actually that easy, which is making 2D and 3D mixed environments today. It's been over a decade since we last did this stuff, so you'd think we could just render out levels lickety-split and it's no big deal. Super easy, but there's a higher level of fidelity now. Also, we do a bunch of things dynamically. We have dynamic real-time lighting on a 2D scene, which might sound crazy, but it is kind of crazy. But it is cool. It requires some tricky things that I'll go into, but it is not as simple as just raising the res and kicking out levels faster. It's not that easy making maps this big. So in the good old days of the early Infinity Engine games, they started out being 640 by 480. It's not very big. The environment's not very large. They're all split up into little palletized 16 by 16 tiles. And overall, they were not that huge on disk. They were not that huge, even if you looked at them all together. Today, our standard screen size is 1920 and above. That is big. And then when you stitch all those together, you get resolutions that are upwards of 13440 by 7560. That's pretty big. Also, there are 5 of them because we're doing all this interesting dynamic lighting stuff. So in addition to the final, which is what the player typically sees, we also have the diffuse, which is what one thing we use for dynamic lighting. We have the specular map, which is used for shiny stuff, just like it normally is in other games. Our depth map, which is used for per pixel occlusion, which is very important. We get that for free, but it is something that we have to store and load in memory. And then the normal map, and the normal map is also used to do that dynamic lighting. So when you take 5 images that are that big and you put them on disk and then you try to load them off disk, it's not small, especially when you're trying to make a game that is very, very big. So we have a number of solutions that we're approaching for this, and so far they've worked very well. We do not use full res maps for everything. Our diffuse, spec, and normal are half res. We use DXT compression, which is pretty common. Also, Unity's compressed asset bundles compress it even further, but the problem is that if we're not doing lossless compression, all that stuff happens at runtime, and then you have levels that take a long time to load, and that's not very fun. So we use a streaming system to stream in tiles at 512 by 512, so when you get into the level, very quickly you see what you need to see, and it loads in the rest in the background. So we were initially pretty concerned about this, but we're glad that we're able to make these very high fidelity, beautiful environments with cool dynamic touches, and we don't really have to worry that much about the performance hit, which you'd think would be weird. That was the thing. 2D maps today, that shouldn't really be a problem. But also, scope matters, not so much the size of individual maps, but all the maps that we're going to have. We know we need to have lots of areas. Baldur's Gate 2 was at least 100 hours of gameplay for a lot of people. Some people reported up to 200 hours of gameplay. There's lots and lots of maps. Even the Icewind Dale games, which were not comparatively that large, could be around 100 hours of gameplay depending on how you played it. And a lot of that was due to the number of areas. A lot of areas, a lot of different types of areas, very diverse. That was another thing that's very big in these games. We probably don't need quite as many maps as the craziest of them, as many as BG2, but we still need a lot of them. So to handle this in terms of scope, we are doing a lot of planning. It sort of goes without saying, but for this it's very important. It's very easy, we found, for designers and artists to get bogged down building these 2D maps. Our initial thought was, well, geez, the rendering technology is so powerful now. You can make the most detailed things you want. You can spend as much time as you want on it. You don't really want to spend as much time as you want on it because you have to make a lot of maps and you actually have to render those things out. So we do a lot of planning. We use standardized 3D blockouts in Unity. We have a blockout tool that allows us to view the level from an isometric perspective. That allows designers to do a lot of play testing within that space so that when it goes to the 2D, or I shouldn't say the 2D artist, to the 3D artist to make the scene that's going to get rendered into 2D, there's not a lot of funny business going on. But it was important for us to get that isometric blockout tool. It is very MC Escher-y and weird if you don't actually set it up the right way. So once we did that, we found the pipeline has actually been pretty smooth. We also have to be very careful about truly unique assets. Again, it's the 3D artists who now know that they just can render it out to 2D. It's, oh, I can make anything. But we have to be very careful about how much time we spend on individual assets, what unique assets go into each area, and we have to think a lot about how we want to repurpose and reuse things so that the player feels like they have a rich and diverse environment, but we can't be literally making every asset on every map from scratch every time. That's not good. Our wilderness areas, we were initially kind of concerned about this. Wilderness areas were a big part of Baldur's Gate. They're great for exploration. They kind of had a low content density in them, but the more we thought about it, the more we realized that they could be a great ally for us in terms of we can build them very fast. We can move content around in them very easily. It's very flexible. You can have all sorts of strange encounters. When we thought about it, one of the things that was very cool about Baldur's Gate especially is that you could encounter almost anything in the wilderness, and it seemed cool. Like, even if it seemed weird, it still seemed cool that you found that encounter out there. So for us, we can move these areas around. to make the exploration feel the way we want it to feel, to make sure the player feels like they can go in many directions, and then also we can give them lots of different rewards. They're very flexible for us. A dungeon map or a city map is not necessarily as flexible for us, and it also actually is very expensive to build in comparison. So we found that these wilderness areas are great. Also, when we outsource those wilderness areas, the pipeline goes very smoothly. In a lot of cases, we're talking about natural assets, natural features. We can concept them on our end very simply. The outsourcing house can take it from there. There's usually very little specificity and communication that's needed. They usually hit it very close on the first try. Again, compared to a dungeon or a city or something that's a little more constrained where you have a lot more tight control over encounters from the get-go, that was a little riskier. So by outsourcing specifically the wilderness stuff, we found that we're able to have a lot of these without needing to have a lot of crazy iteration on them. And finally, smart material and rendering guidelines. When we first started out in pre-production, it was not good. We were rendering out a village area in 33 hours. That's kind of stupid. So we looked at it and realized we should not use every single trick in the rendering book just to render these out. In a lot of cases, we found that we weren't actually getting much out of using every bell and whistle. So we came up with sensible guidelines about how do we handle reflections, how do we handle displacement, how much of it do we do, and we found that the levels actually wound up looking better because we could iterate on them faster, and we could get the render times down to about an hour and a half. And of course, we set those up on a remote network computer, so it went a lot faster. But again, it wasn't as easy as just starting to shoot out these levels super fast. I talked before about that party-based real-time combat, but it goes beyond that. It's about the rules and the feeling of the world. This is not just the combat, it's not just the conversation, but it's also the style of things, how they look, how they feel, how characters are dressed, how colors are used in the environment. It's a whole lot of stuff. So we wanted to make our own rule set. We're not using Dungeons & Dragons. We're using a rule set that we're making. We're not using the Forgotten Realms. We're not using the Planescape setting. We're not using Greyhawk. We're using a setting that we're making. But we did want it to feel familiar to people, and we wanted it to draw them in more than try to shock them with something crazy and new. And these pieces of art that I picked are sort of from the era that I think of when I think of first and second edition AD&D. All the Infinity Engine games, except for Icewind Dale 2, were sort of from the previous era of rules and stylization of art. If you look at newer Dungeons & Dragons art or even newer fantasy art, it doesn't really look a lot like this. Things are a little more exaggerated. Materials are not quite rendered in this way, and that's something that there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way they're done today, but it's not the way they were done in the late 90s and early 2000s. So we wanted to go back to that feeling. So the tricky thing is, how do we, that said burying it, but I had to change it. So praising D&D, but moving past it. All those games were AD&D. They were pretty fun. We're not making an AD&D game, but we want it to feel like that. So when we're talking to our fans, when we're designing these rules, we don't want to throw things out just for the sake of throwing them out. In addition to some of those rules actually being pretty darn good and work just fine, the feeling of them is important to the people that back this project. This is a nostalgia-driven game in a lot of ways, so we can't ignore that. We also recognize, though, that a little bit of the clumsiness of those games. I have watched all sorts of people play or try to play Infinity Engine games, and D&D is not something that is intuitive to a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily need to be super intuitive, but when we see someone sitting down and wanting to play the game, and they're not able to play the game because it is super confusing, that's not really cool. So our assumption is people want to play this game. They're not necessarily all going to be super awesome tactical geniuses, little baby D&D Rommels rolling around and murdering everything. So we wanted to have a system that could scale well in terms of difficulty, but still be a challenge to people in the way that it's meant to be. For that, a lot of this is that difficulty is about more than numbers. If you have a super hard game and you just scale the hit points of things down and the damage of things down, that doesn't necessarily make it easier in a way that makes players go, yep, this is still the same fun game. You just kind of made it easy in a way that's not necessarily any more interesting. If you make things harder by just bumping up the health and the attack rates and things like that, it's the same deal. So when we think about how we handle difficulty, it's about a lot more than just scaling numbers. It's about changing the nature of encounters. We have an encounter system that will add or remove characters from the scene in different locations, making the actual positioning of those characters more of a difference. We will replace creatures. Creatures that are actually presenting one type of tactical threat are replaced with a creature that, combined with other creatures in the environment, are posing a more complex tactical threat. We can scale these things so the player feels like they're getting a different type of engagement with these things, but we're not just shifting the numbers up and down. I'm sorry, this is a slide full of text. I was going to show our options menus, but they were just GUI menus full of text. So difficulty is also about more than just combat. People want different things out of these games. They want to see different things when they're in conversations. So when a person is in conversation, sometimes they want to see what ability scores are unlocking a node of dialogue. Some people do not want to see that. When people hover over an enemy and they see the tooltip, some people want to see their attack and defense information. Some people don't want to see that at all. Some people, when they get quests, they want an explicit objective. When they open their quest log, they want to see, go get this fucking thing from this guy right now. Other people want to read the text. They don't want to see an objective. They want to read the text and just figure it out. They want to figure it out. They want to figure out where to go. They want to figure all this stuff out. And that, I mean, that's something that's changed in RPGs quite a lot. So we are actually putting all these options in. We know from our fans that different people want different things. Some of these are bundled into overall difficulty modes. Others, people can go in and just click on and off. But we feel like we're going to get a big range of player satisfaction from this. This goes back to the touch and the feel of classic AD&D. So when it comes to how characters look, how the world looks, the colors we use, shape and proportion of things, especially for creatures or characters that are this small, there is a lot to be said for making them very exaggerated, to make an exaggerated silhouette, to use exaggerated colors. That's not the feel of these games. These games did not exaggerate those things. These games used a relatively desaturated palette. They used relatively realistically proportioned characters, relatively sort of accurate armor and weapons and things like that. So as we set out to design these characters, these creatures, these environments, we are trying to make sure that they are capturing that same sort of feeling. It feels more naturalistic. It's not purely natural. It's not purely realistic, but it has that flavor and that feeling to it. This also goes to graphic user interfaces. A lot of split opinion on these guys. Skeuomorphic GUIs are not super cool these days. iOS 7 said goodbye. But we're saying, hello, we're going to continue using these. All the Infinity Engine games had skeuomorphic GUIs, that is, graphical user interfaces that resembled real-world stuff as though we were simulating opening a book. I just opened this journal that looks like an iPad, an iPad made of wood and parchment. It's not literally supposed to be an object, but it is made of materials. It captures a feeling. Baldur's Gate used stone. Icewind Dale used stone. Icewind Dale 2 used wood. Planescape Torment used rusty metal. All of them had these solid feelings, skeuomorphic GUIs. Our philosophy on it was, we know that people are going to be split on this. More people do favor this style of graphic user interface. Some people do prefer more floating wireframey type stuff. But we believe that as long as the function of the graphical user interface is not inhibited by us using the style, it's better to do it this way because it captures that feeling more accurately. It still feels like an Infinity Engine style game. And of course, storytelling, it's a big deal for our company. It's a big deal for a lot of companies. We take it really seriously. We wanted to tell a story in a way that we had not told in a while, which is primarily through text, not a lot of voice acting. There's not going to be a lot of VO in this game. There's not a lot of VO in the Infinity Engine games either. Also, our budget is not insane, so we can't voice act every line like New Vegas, where it was 65,000 lines of fully voiced dialogue. So we didn't want to do that again, but it posed some challenges to us. First of all, Eternity is written for readers. This might seem like, so what? A lot of games these days are not written for readers. They write dialogue with the assumption that no one wants to read them. Don't quite get it. For these games, we believe very strongly that the people that are playing these games, they want to read some stuff, they want to read some text. It's our responsibility to make that text enjoyable and to make that dialogue interesting and to make those item descriptions cool and the quests fun and all that stuff. But our assumption is that people are going to want to read, so we're writing for them. We're not writing with the assumption that we need to have 80 characters and then a person is going to click through it because they're tired or bored, or they're waiting for a VO line to end, because that's not the style of game at all. Interaction with characters is extremely important for us. Again, the traditional, well, I shouldn't say the traditional, the way we've been doing this recently is with cutscenes and cinematics and fully animated characters and facial animation and mocap and all that stuff. And we're not doing that. We're writing compelling characters that are compelling when you read them talking to you in text, and they emote actions to you. So this is something that is very, very unusual. We haven't had to actually write out descriptive text for what a character does. This character shrugs. He smiles at you slyly. He reaches across the bar and grabs you. All these things are described. They're not animated. In many ways, it's actually pretty liberating because we don't have to worry when we write these things, oh, geez, is the animation team going to be taken down because of my special animation where I slap this guy and like, oh, no, you just describe it. And that's, again, the style of game. And we want the player to feel very engaged with these characters. It's very important. We're taking this a step farther, which is scripted interactions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a great game, one of my favorite games from the early 90s, which is Darklands. Darklands used, yeah, all right, buddy, one guy. Two, all right. So scripted interactions were they were illustrated scenes where you would take some aspect of the environment and you would illustrate it, and then you'd write a text description to describe what was going on to the player, give them a sense of atmosphere, what was going on in the area, and then you give them options. It's like a little interactive choose-your-own-adventure, and for each of the things you do, there's a little illustration. We abstract the characters. We abstract the environment with these loose but beautiful black and white drawings. And again, we found that these are extremely enjoyable to make. They feel really cool. They give you a great sense of atmosphere. And again, so in this example, hey, you come up to a pool. It's a crazy pool. There's all sorts of stuff going on, and you can jump down in this tunnel and swim around. We do not have to build a tunnel and a swimming animation and swimming mechanics where your character swims down. We can say, you do it, man. You swim. It's crazy. You go past all these fish and some seaweed and check out this little drawing of seaweed, and you make it out. Cool. Here's some treasure. We can do a lot of that sort of stuff. It'll be cooler than that. But we can do a lot of this stuff without a huge amount of expense. And again, it frees us up to have interactions that we want without feeling constrained by what are the explicit systems that you can use, what are the explicit animation assets that you have. It doesn't really matter for us. When we started making Infinity Engine games, the first of which was actually Planescape Torment, BioWare's tool was pretty good at that time. Holy crap, in retrospect, it was not easy to use. All the dialogues that branched were actually laid out in a flat list. That's not very fun to edit nodes of like hundreds and thousands of lines of dialogue in that manner. We have great tools now. We can write dialogues that branch a lot. They have tons of reactivity. We can throw scripting commands in super easy without making horrible bugs for ourselves, which we did all the time in the good old days. We can do all that stuff, but it's actually become more important for us than ever to have meaningful choices for the player. Certainly a lot of the old games had a lot of filler dialogue. They had just random things that felt sort of pointless to ask. Some of those pointless things were very entertaining, which is also a good reason to have a note of dialogue. But for us now, it's very important, because we can write dialogue very, very quickly, even though we know people want to read, they want to read good dialogue. They don't just want to read stuff. So when we think about the choices we give to the player, we're thinking about what is going to engage them. When they make a choice, what feedback are we going to give them that's going to make them happy that they picked that choice? When something plays out in the future, how is that going to be followed up on? All these things are things that we think about when we're building these structures, not just mechanically in the sense of, well, this dialogue shouldn't be more than 50 nodes, but because we want the player to feel like with this role-playing game, they have a lot of ability to interact with characters, to interact with the story, and make it their own. And a lot of that is framed by the types of choices we give them. There are things yet to figure out here. So this is a screenshot we released, and you might notice, as about 100,000 of our fans let us know, that the characters don't quite blend in with the environment. Dynamic stuff kind of got solved a while ago because we stopped really combining, in a lot of places, we stopped combining dynamic and baked lighting. But now we have these very, very detailed environments that are now in 2D, and it's very hard to get 2D, it's very hard to get lighting information back out of them to make the players fit into them. So this leads to the old Scooby-Doo effect, which is when you're going down a hall and you see one of the rocks that's kind of standing out from the others, and you're like, hey, Fred, why don't you check that rock? That's going to open a secret door or something. We don't want that. It makes everything stand out in a weird way. There are a number of ways that we can solve this, some of which we're starting on. We don't know exactly which way it'll go. But we're using level-specific environments maps. That helps ground characters very well. In this game, a lot of people have a lot of metal. They got swords. They got plate mail, all that stuff. That helps ground them a lot. We were previously using an ambient light to help the characters stand out in the environment. That helps them stand out too much. They never look quite right unless they're in just the right spot. So we're not going to use that anymore. We are thinking of using some sort of light probe, whether it's Unity's light probe system or something that we roll ourselves to simulate the lighting from the level in there. Also shadow map sampling, where is the character standing, what is the shadow map intensity in that area, and then tinting the character appropriately. And finally, our shadows, which look really cool, and they conform to the collision geometry and all that neat stuff. They're one-directional, and so obviously when they move relative to lights, it does not look convincing. So we're thinking of using point light generated dynamic shadows, possibly lower detail, but even if they're lower detail, we feel that they will ground the characters better and be less distracting, which is more important. To conclude, wow, I'm actually on time. This project is only possible because of our backers. Man, oh man, I cannot even imagine the publisher that we would have had to go to say, hey man, we're going to make this PC, OS X, Linux, isometric, party-based role-playing game. It's mouse and keyboard only. Don't even think of putting a controller with it. The maps are going to be huge and crazy. No publisher would have backed that. Only Kickstarter or some other crowdfunding platform would have allowed us to do this. We owe them an experience more than any individual bit of rules or type of level or type of encounter. We owe them a feeling of that experience that they went through. That can be hard to capture. It's the zeitgeist of late 90s D&D style fantasy role-playing games, an era that has kind of passed. So for us, a lot of it comes down to when we're debating whether or not to change something or leave it alone, we think about how it makes us feel relative to those old games, how we believe it will make our fans feel more than anything else, both in the short term and in the long run. And we believe that that authenticity will help them ultimately have their trust in us rewarded. Thank you. I guess we have 2 minutes and 20 seconds for questions and answers. Anyone? Any cues? All right.
So yeah, as an old school game, I'm personally very happy for this, but you touched on making it more accessible to other gamers. Besides just toning down the difficulty level of combat encounters, is there anything else you're doing, like a more nuanced learning curve, things like that?
Yeah, so the question is really, in terms of accessibility, other than lowering difficulty, what are we doing towards that effect? So learning curve is something that we're trying to ease players into. Early on, we're not throwing every system and subsystem at them at once. That was really horrible in the Icewind Dale games. Make 6 second edition D&D characters at once and then get thrown into a blender. So in terms of letting the player understand how the fundamental mechanics of managing their own character, then managing multiple characters, managing inventory. We also are very cognizant of some of the things that were just insanely frustrating in the old games, like managing the inventory of 6 characters at once was not super fun or enjoyable. But again, there are aspects of it that people really like. I wanted to have a unified inventory where there was just everybody shares one thing. And a lot of people said but I don't want my fighter to carry scrolls. I want my wizard to carry scrolls. That's a real fucking thing, man. And so, but that feeling of I want this character to carry this stuff. Or even if it's this is my thief carries the gems. So again, that goes to that feeling. And so we found a way to have unified packs on one screen where you'd see everyone's pack at once, but they were all their own separate inventories. So when you move the characters around and they are added and leave, they still actually have their own space that's demarcated for them. So I kind of went off track there, but it's kind of thinking about stuff like that. Things where we know that if you're not an AD&D junkie or a D&D junkie, you're just going to get rolled. So easing you into that stuff, smoothing the curves on that to make it easier to get into. Again, our belief is we're assuming you want to play a game like this. We're assuming you want to play a D&D-ish game. A lot of people who want to play those games are not good at them. That is okay, but we have to help them get into it. And then with the rest of the stuff, it's about kind of looking at the decisions we made in the past that turned out to not be that great, like inventory and stuff like that. Anyone else? The answer is no. The answer is it's the end. All right, thank you everyone for coming.